I never expected to wake up to bulldozers surrounding my family's orchard, or Margaret from the HOA smirking as they tore into my trees. But she made one fatal mistake. She didn't realize I controlled the water supply keeping her entire neighborhood alive. What would you do if your HOA tried to destroy your property, while secretly overcharging your neighbors $500 a month for water you owned? Stick around, because by the time I exposed their $300,000 fraud, Margaret wasn't just fined, she was led away in handcuffs. I'm Daniel Wilson, an ex-engineer who walked away from a hectic city life to tend the orchard my grandfather planted decades ago. My house sits on a gentle slope overlooking rows of apple trees, heritage varieties with twisted trunks and sweet blossoms that fill the air with a delicate fragrance each spring. After 20 years in the engineering world, I wanted simplicity, not conflict. Yet, since I moved back, my quiet orchard has been an eyesore for Margaret Reynolds, the powerful and meticulously coiffed president of the Meadow Springs Estates HOA. I'd heard the stories, how Margaret fined a retired couple hundreds of dollars because their wheelchair ramp didn't match the approved color scheme, or how she forced the Patels down the street to rip up their backyard vegetable garden because it wasn't decorative enough. I knew she was trouble, but I didn't realize just how far she would go until the bulldozers arrived. It happened just after sunrise. I was sipping my coffee in the orchard, admiring the pink buds on my apple trees. Suddenly, the distant whine of heavy machinery shattered the morning calm. I rushed to the front of my property and found two bulldozers rumbling across the boundary line, leveling a narrow strip of grass that separated my orchard from the community's main access road. Standing atop the lead bulldozer was Margaret Reynolds, her blonde hair sculpted into a helmet-like style that defied the breeze. She wore a pristine pantsuit, and I swear she didn't even flinch at the dust swirling around her. "Stop!" I shouted, sprinting toward the commotion. Workers in hard hats paused, glancing uncertainly at Margaret. She lifted a manicured finger and pointed it at me like I was a bug she intended to squash. "Daniel Wilson," she called out, her voice cutting through the machinery noise. "These orchard trees are in clear violation of the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. We've authorized immediate action to conceal them from public view." Public view? My orchard was on private property that dated back nearly a century, long before any HOA existed. I tried to keep calm. "Margaret, you have no right to do this. You're trespassing, damaging my land. You can't just bulldoze a trench around my orchard." Her lips curved into a smug smile. "Oh, but we can. Section 9.2 of the bylaws grants the HOA the authority to remedy unsightly conditions that affect property values. These bulldozers are here to install a tall privacy fence around your orchard, and if we happen to tear out a few trees in the process, well, that's your fault for failing to comply." One bulldozer lurched forward, gouging the earth dangerously close to my oldest apple tree. My heart pounded. I waved my arms to stop them. "I'll sue you for every cent if you damage these trees." Margaret sighed dramatically, signaling the driver to pause. "We already fined you for failing to hide your orchard, Daniel. You ignored the notices. Now the penalty escalates. It's at $100 per day and rising. If you want the bulldozers gone, comply with the fence installation and pay the fines." She snapped her fingers at a man in a tailored suit who jumped off the second bulldozer. "This is Richard Taylor, our HOA lawyer. He'll ensure everything is nice and legal." I glanced at Richard, who gave me a slimy grin. "As Miss Reynolds said, we're within our rights. I advise you to stand down." But I wasn't backing down. My grandfather had once told me, "If anyone ever tries to take our land, remember what's in the fine print." At the time, I thought he meant some old boundary dispute. I never imagined it would come to this. That afternoon, I stood on the edge of my orchard, watching the bulldozers encircle it with churned-up dirt. Large steel posts were dropped into the ground, the start of a massive fence that threatened to shut me out of my own property. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Gerald Wilson, our longtime neighbor who lived across the creek, no relation, just the same last name by coincidence. Gerald was a retired plumber, 80 years old with a bad hip but a sharp mind. "Daniel, I saw what Margaret and her goons are up to," he said, shaking his head. "They tried something similar with me last year over my pond aerator. Fined me hundreds of dollars. If I didn't pay, they threatened to foreclose on my house. Can you believe that?" I clenched my jaw. "It's outrageous. She's crossing a line." Gerald nodded. "You're not alone. People around here are fed up. The Patels, the Hendersons, Susan Winters, who had to tear down her greenhouse. The HOA's gotten away with so much because everyone's scared. or they can't afford a lengthy legal fight. His words lit a fire in me. If I had any legal angle, any advantage at all, I needed to find it. I thanked Gerald and hurried inside, determined to do some serious digging. I spent the next several days in my attic, sifting through boxes of old family documents, receipts for farming equipment, letters from the county, even a tattered blueprint showing the orchard's irrigation lines. Finally, at the bottom of a trunk that smelled of mothballs and nostalgia, I found it. A yellowed envelope marked Wilson Estate Water Rights, 1932. Inside were land deeds and legal contracts from nearly a century ago. My great-grandfather had purchased primary water rights for the entire creek system that ran under the future Meadow Springs development. A paragraph jumped out at me. The Wilson family retains full ownership and control of all water sources deriving from Willow Creek, including associated irrigation lines and distribution points. Any future development or homeowners association established on said land cannot override or negate these rights. My heart pounded. If this was still valid, and it sure looked like it was, I might have the ability to shut off or reroute water to large portions of Meadow Springs estates, including the golf course and those lush, HOA-approved lawns. Armed with my newfound documents, I confronted Margaret in front of the half-finished fence. The bulldozers were gone for the day, but stacks of fencing material remained. Residents had begun gathering nearby, curious about the heated exchange they saw coming. I held up the 1932 deed. Margaret, you might want to stop construction before you make the biggest mistake of your life. My family's water rights predate your precious HOA. If you damage my orchard or try to push me off my own land, I can legally shut off water to half this community. Margaret took the documents, scanning them with obvious skepticism. Richard hovered behind her, glancing over her shoulder. I saw his lips twitch in concern when he reached the part about grandfathered rights. This means nothing, Margaret scoffed, but her trembling voice betrayed her. HOAs have broad authority. Not against county-registered water rights, I shot back, loud enough for onlookers to hear. Keep messing with my orchard, and we'll see how well those manicured lawns survive without irrigation. A few neighbors murmured in agreement, bold enough to nod but still wary of Margaret's retaliation. Richard took Margaret's elbow, whispering something that made her go pale, then flush red. Finally, she tossed the documents back at me. I'll have my lawyers look into it. For now, construction stays. And if you try anything with the water, I'll make sure the entire board votes to seize this orchard and drain you financially. That night, around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of rustling and snapping branches in the orchard. Grabbing a flashlight, I ran outside. Under the moonlight, I saw two masked individuals near my oldest apple tree. They were sawing at a branch, a vile-smelling liquid sloshing in a canister at their feet. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting toward them. They scattered, dropping the saw and leaving the canister behind. The orchard was eerily silent, except for the distant hum of streetlights. I knelt down and sniffed the liquid, some kind of chemical herbicide or pesticide concentrate. My mind reeled. This was intentional sabotage, and I had a pretty good idea who had orchestrated it. Nobody else in the neighborhood had a motive to poison my trees. Margaret was upping the stakes, proving how ruthless she could be. In the faint moonlight, I saw that one branch had been deeply cut, and a few saplings near the orchard's edge were sprayed with the chemical. Furious, I vowed to get proof that Margaret was behind this. If she thought she could bully or intimidate me, she'd just awakened a side of me she'd regret meeting. The next morning, I inspected the damage in daylight. Several small trees wilted, leaves burned brown. I called Officer Rodriguez from the county sheriff's office to file a vandalism report. He noted the sabotage, but admitted proving Margaret's direct involvement would be tough without video evidence or witnesses. News traveled quickly. Neighbors stopped by my orchard, outraged by the escalation. Mrs. Patel shook her head. They cut my garden last year, claimed it was over the property line. If I spoke up, I'd get more fines. Now they're doing the same to you. Susan Winters, a widow in her 70s, teared up as she recounted how the HOA forced her to pay $500 in fines because her granddaughter's little treehouse was not in architectural harmony. I realized something. These people were scared of losing their homes, of mounting HOA debts, of Margaret's power. But now they saw she'd gone too far, trespassing in the dead of night to poison heritage apple trees. That fear was starting to turn into anger and solidarity. Gerald knocked on my door carrying a thick stack of documents. "Hope you like reading," he said with a grin. "I've spent months collecting public HOA records, financial statements, water usage reports, everything I could get my hands on. We spread the papers across my dining table. He pointed to an unusual line item labeled Community Irrigation Fund, quarterly charges in the hundreds of dollars per household, supposedly for maintenance and water distribution. Yet, as far as Gerald and I could tell, no major improvements had been made to the community irrigation system in years. Then came an interesting discovery: large transfers from the HOA account to a shell corporation called MSE Holdings LLC. Each transfer was just under $10,000, likely to avoid certain reporting triggers. And guess who was listed as an officer in the incorporation records? Margaret Reynolds. My pulse quickened. Gerald, if we prove the HOA is illegally diverting funds, we could tear down this entire corrupt operation. Margaret wouldn't just lose control, she'd face criminal charges. Gerald's eyes sparkled with determination. You find the smoking gun, and I'll help you present it. I'm too old for these bullies, and I'm tired of watching neighbors get fleeced. The following week, the Meadow Springs Estates monthly HOA meeting took place in the lavishly decorated community clubhouse. A glitzy chandelier hung above rows of chairs. Usually only a handful of residents bothered to attend, but word of the orchard conflict had spread. By the time I arrived, the room was packed, dozens of neighbors glaring at the HOA board at the front table. Margaret sat at the center, flanked by Richard Taylor and a few other board members. The moment she saw me enter with a bulging folder under my arm, her eyes narrowed. Before we begin, she announced coolly, I have an urgent matter. Mr. Daniel Wilson has repeatedly refused to comply with HOA directives regarding his orchard. The board proposes a penalty of $5,000 for his disregard of our community standards. A collective gasp swept the room. People started whispering. I stepped forward to the microphone. Margaret, that orchard is legally grandfathered in. You have no authority to fence it off or fine me. And you sure can't bulldoze my property in the dead of night, no matter what your so-called bylaws say. Let's maintain order, please, Richard said, sounding annoyed. I continued, raising my voice so everyone could hear. The real issue here isn't my orchard. It's the thousands of dollars in water fees the HOA's been collecting from homeowners, money that was supposed to maintain an irrigation system, which, by the way, we barely use. I have evidence that these funds were diverted to a private LLC connected to Margaret Reynolds. A stunned silence followed. Margaret's face froze in shock. She tapped her pen nervously on the table. This is a baseless accusation. We can discuss finances under new business. For now, we must address Mr. Wilson's orchard. A low rumble of discontent rippled through the audience. People weren't buying her deflection. They demanded answers, pressing forward to see the documents in my hands. Just then, Jane Martinez, a manager from the County Water Authority, entered the room. I'd called her earlier, explaining how the HOA might be misusing water rights. She carried an official binder and wore a no-nonsense expression. Excuse the interruption, Jane said, stepping up to the front of the room, but we've conducted a preliminary audit of the Meadow Springs water usage and associated fees. She opened her binder, reading aloud. We found no official record of funds being used for mandated irrigation upgrades. Instead, there are multiple large transfers to an entity called MSE Holdings LLC. Margaret tried to interrupt, but Jane raised a hand to stop her. Furthermore, according to county records, the Wilson family holds primary water rights for the entire Willow Creek watershed, which underlies much of Meadow Springs. Any modifications to that water distribution system must be approved by them. This includes extensive fencing or construction that might impede flow or damage existing lines. People in the audience muttered in surprise. Many had no idea my orchard's water rights gave me that much leverage. Jane turned toward me and gave a small nod, confirming that she was on my side. A bead of sweat trickled down Margaret's temple. Richard leaned in and whispered furiously, but it was too late. The cat was out of the bag. The neighbors were livid, demanding to know if their high monthly water fees had been pocketed. Mrs. Patel stood, voice trembling with anger. My husband and I have struggled to pay these fees, and now you're telling me it's all been a scam? That's theft. We trusted you. An older veteran, Mr. Fisher, slammed his cane on the floor. You fined me $300 for painting my door the wrong shade of beige, Margaret. Meanwhile, you're siphoning money from our community fund? Margaret's face turned red, then white. This is all a misunderstanding, she insisted, her composure unraveling. We needed that money for legal fees for improvements. Richard tried to rescue her. Let's not jump to conclusions, folks. We're investigating an alleged misinterpretation of the financial records. If there's any wrongdoing, we'll correct it. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Anger radiated off them like heat on a summer day. Sensing her iron grip slipping, Margaret abruptly called for a board-only executive session, announcing that everyone else had to leave the room. Neighbors erupted in protest, refusing to budge. "We pay your salaries," someone shouted. "You don't get to hide from us in a private meeting." The tension soared. Richard threatened to summon security to clear the room, but no security guards appeared. Instead, Officer Rodriguez, the same officer who took my vandalism report, stepped inside, arms folded. His voice carried authority. "I've received multiple complaints, and I'm here to maintain order. I suggest you let these residents speak, Ms. Reynolds, or I'll have reason to suspect an attempt to conceal evidence of financial misconduct." Caught between a furious crowd and a potential criminal investigation, Margaret's face twisted in despair. She sank back into her seat. "Fine," she whispered. "Let them talk." Gerald, who'd been standing quietly in the back, stepped forward and placed a manila folder on the table before Margaret and the board. "This folder has about 200 pages of evidence, bank transfers, deposit slips, everything you and Richard have tried to keep off the official HOA books." The hush in the room was deafening as page after page of damning evidence flashed on a projector screen. I'd set it up with the help of a few other neighbors who were done being bullied. The amounts added up to nearly $300,000 over 5 years. Margaret stared at the projector, lips quivering. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Richard grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The neighbors looked ready to riot. Officer Rodriguez coughed into his hand, stepping forward. "Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Taylor, under county law, diverting community funds for personal gain is considered fraud and embezzlement. I suggest you remain where you are while I make a few calls." In a last-ditch effort, Margaret leapt to her feet and slammed her palms on the table, tears streaming down her cheeks. "None of you understand the pressure of running this place. Everyone has demands. Everyone wants a perfect neighborhood. I did what I had to do to keep the community afloat." "Afloat?" Mrs. Patel repeated in disbelief. "You extorted us, Margaret. You threatened our homes. You even tried to poison Daniel's orchard because you couldn't stand a few apple trees." Margaret turned to me, rage and desperation flashing in her eyes. "You ruined everything," she hissed. "If you had just put up the fence, none of this would have happened." My voice steadied, though my hands were shaking. "You did this to yourself, Margaret. You tried to steal my land, sabotage my trees, and you've been stealing from these neighbors for years." Neighbors began chanting for the board to resign. Some demanded an immediate vote to dissolve the HOA. Others yelled for the police to arrest Margaret and Richard on the spot. Tensions peaked as Margaret sank into her chair, face in her hands. Richard tried to calm the crowd, but nobody listened. Even the other board members scooted their chairs away from them, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. That's when Harold Fisher tapped the microphone. "I move that we vote to remove Margaret Reynolds and Richard Taylor from the HOA board immediately." A second came from Susan Winters. "I second that motion." Hands shot up in unanimous support. Margaret shrieked, "You can't do this. I'm still the president." But it was no use. Even the board members turned against her, forced to acknowledge the overwhelming vote. Harold wasn't finished. "I further move that we hold a community-wide referendum on whether to dissolve the Meadow Springs Estates HOA entirely, given the scale of the fraud." Roaring applause erupted in the clubhouse. Neighbors had clearly had enough. With every clap, every cheer, a weight lifted from my chest. This was the community that my grandfather had hoped for. One that stood up against bullies. One that protected its own. Margaret made a break for the door. But Officer Rodriguez blocked her path. He calmly read her rights, stating she was under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement and property damage. The sight of Margaret in handcuffs, sobbing and disheveled, seemed unreal. Richard tried to slip out the back but was similarly escorted into custody. Some neighbors watched in stunned silence. Others filmed on their phones. It would be the talk of the entire county by morning. Over the next few days, the temporary HOA board worked with the county to freeze the association's assets. Meanwhile, a special election was set. Residents would decide whether to replace the HOA with a simpler volunteer-run neighborhood committee or dissolve it entirely. I had mixed feelings. Relief at seeing justice served, sadness for the orchard damage, but also an odd sense of hope. Things were changing. A week later, the bulldozers were gone, the half-finished fence dismantled. Volunteers helped me clear out the damaged saplings, and an arborist recommended treatments for the poisoned trees. Neighbors pitched in, donating time, money, and materials to help restore what Margaret had tried to destroy. Gerald oversaw the repair of my irrigation lines. Some had been crushed by the fence posts, and with the orchard healing, I decided to host a small community gathering to celebrate. We had tables of homemade pies, fresh apple cider, and grilled vegetables from the Patel's re-established garden. Kids ran between the apple trees, playing tag in the dappled sunshine. Music drifted through the air, and I felt the weight of the past weeks lift from my shoulders. During the celebration, Officer Rodriguez dropped by with a warm smile. "Wanted to let you know, Daniel, the investigation into Margaret and Richard's finances is turning up more evidence every day. They'll be facing felony charges." "Good," I said, offering him a cup of cider. "They deserve it for what they did to everyone here." He nodded. "By the way, I've heard the referendum on dissolving the HOA is almost unanimous. Congratulations on setting this place free." I thanked him, feeling a rush of gratitude. It wasn't just me. It was Gerald, the Patels, Susan, Harold, and everyone who had refused to stay silent. 2 months later, by an overwhelming margin, the community voted to formally dissolve the Meadow Springs Estates HOA. Where once fear and compliance ruled, now a sense of camaraderie blossomed. Margaret and Richard faced a string of legal battles: embezzlement, fraud, property damage, and more. They lost their homes to pay restitution, and from what I heard, Margaret was utterly disgraced in every social circle she once presided over like a queen. Meanwhile, we established the Meadow Springs Neighborhood Co-op. No heavy-handed rules, just a collective fund that neighbors could contribute to voluntarily for shared improvements. The orchard became a symbol of the new era, a place where families could gather, kids could play, and nobody needed to fear an arbitrary fine. On a warm autumn afternoon, I strolled through the orchard, plucking a ripe apple and taking a crisp, sweet bite. Gerald ambled up beside me, leaning on his cane. "I've lived here nearly 50 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen folks so united. We owe you a debt of thanks, Daniel, for standing up to those bullies." I shook my head. "We did this together. If you hadn't collected all that evidence, if the neighbors hadn't spoken up, Margaret would have kept terrorizing us." He grinned, surveying the orchard. "Your grandfather would be proud. You protected this land and gave the community back its voice." I smiled, offering him an apple. Nearby, kids laughed as they filled baskets with fruit for a charity drive. The sweet smell of apples in the air felt like victory. A victory for my family's legacy, for our neighbors, and for the simple truth that greed and corruption can't stand when an entire community fights back. Fade out on the orchard, thriving and free, just like the people of Meadow Springs now that the HOA is gone for good.